So Jozef Puska has been found guilty of the murder of Ashling Murphy. No surprise to anyone. I mean, I think the judge really summed it up in a couple of lines, saying there was evil in the courtroom and really questioning why the Ashling Murphy's family were put through this.
Yeah, so today when the verdict came through, Justice Tony Hunt, he did say to the jury that he was glad that they didn't waste any more of their valuable time on Puska's nonsense. He was very critical of Puska and his defence. He did say, however, that it was no reflection of Michael Bowman, senior counsel for the defence, or his team on the defence that they gave. It was more so the farcical story that Jozef Puska came up with.
Yeah, obviously a defence team or any legal team have to be instructed by their client. They don't get to choose. They may get to choose to advise on strategy. They don't get to choose, what the position their client takes. I mean, it's gone on for 4 weeks, Clodagh. You've been in there for the majority of the time. What sort of impression did you get of Jozef Puska when, we've had to be very careful in discussing this, being very neutral. I mean, as you listen to the evidence that he gave, the convoluted stories, the fact that he was outright lying and clearly lying at times, it's very, very kind of unusual for somebody. It's quite a sort of sociopathic way to behave, isn't it?
Yeah, like you're saying there, we had to be so careful. Like, I suppose when you're covering these cases in court and there's, whispers amongst the lawyers, you're like, oh my God, what have I said? What have I done? They're going to call me out and I'm going to be the reason this trial has collapsed. But yeah, we can talk a lot more freely now. I mean, Jozef Puska, throughout the trial, he was sitting with his interpreter in the dock. There was a big sense of family. His whole family almost were there almost every single day. Kind of in the latter couple of days, there was more members of the family present, and they were all in court today for the verdict. He seems to be a sort of, very hard to read, I would say. He gave no reaction or emotion to the verdict. I think it actually took him a minute to realise what had happened because obviously it was being translated to him. He just kind of hung his head and put it in his hands. Throughout the court, he's kind of sat very attentively. Obviously, there's a lot going on. I would say he's trying to hear what's happening in English, but also listening to his translator. And it can be hard to take in all that information as a journalist sitting there, but to have kind of two different conversations going on, I'd say it was a lot for him to take in. He just seemed kind of, I would say, overwhelmed by the proceedings.
Did he react emotionally, like when some of the very graphic descriptions of how Ashling Murphy died, was he reacting to that? Was he standing stone-faced?
No, he was very stone-faced, I would say. There was kind of a lot of deep breathing and sort of like sighs almost. And again, I would say that was just him taking in the vast amount of the translation. And I suppose he's not hearing things in the same time scale that we are. He's hearing them, a couple of seconds, maybe a minute or so later after it's been translated to him. But there wasn't really much palpable emotion.
Yeah.
I didn't see him kind of being teary-eyed or kind of,
displaying
gritting his
stress.
Yeah, there was none of that.
I mean, I suppose, like when you look at something like this sort of case, I mean, obviously we heard, I think, in the opening statement where the prosecution said Ashling Murphy's we're not gonna hear too much about her, because it's not her on trial, it's Jozef Puska on trial. But I suppose the reason this story really impacted on people is because Ashling Murphy was an absolutely blameless young woman. I mean, I'm not saying anybody is to blame who's a victim of that sort of crime, but really, she was a young woman, a school teacher who nobody had a bad word to say about. She lived a blameless life in a rural part of Ireland. She obviously was out jogging, and you would hope that a young woman in those circumstances in a country like Ireland is safe.
Yeah.
You would hope that, that she would not ever have to encounter any level of threat or violence, let alone to die in such a horrific manner. So that's why it was shocking. And I'm asking about Jozef Puska because it's very hard to understand why somebody would do this.
Oh, absolutely.
And we don't get that, of course, from the trial, do we?
No, I mean, I suppose the only kind of mention we got about Ashling's personality, I suppose, was at the end when, after the verdict, you know, Justice Hunt did say, you know, while we didn't hear much about Ashling Murphy, we can say she loved kids. She was a school teacher. She loved GAA. You know, he referenced back to the, you know, the bloodstained GAA top that we seen during the trial. And he said, you know, that sort of is there's a lot of sense of community in GAA, and that was kind of an example of the good that there is in the world out there, in contrast to what he said was the evil in the room. I mean, when this happened to Ashling Murphy, and I suppose as well, it's how the public often view victims. Especially women can be victimised and victim blamed, in the sense that if it was a sex worker who died, people often see that, you know, there's a level of blame there. Well, she shouldn't have been doing that, and that's where a lot of the outcry came from in Ashling Murphy's death, was because she was seen as this blameless victim who was just going about her day. And I suppose as well, a lot of people, myself included, could see themselves reflected in Ashling Murphy. You know, I remember when it happened at the time, it did upset me. You know, as a journalist, you're supposed to be kind of non-biased and kind of, you know, keep your emotions in check. But, you know, in the privacy of my home, I was still upset. I had COVID, so I couldn't even get a hug at the time. I remember being like that. So it was very emotional to be there today when it kind of came to its conclusion during the sentencing. During the verdict. He will be sentenced on the 17th of November, which is next Friday, so we'll be back for that. But during the verdict, her family held up a framed photograph of Ashling and showed it to the court. And again, after the jury were kind of dismissed and leaving, they again held up this framed photo. And it was at that point the courtroom burst out into round of applause, cheering the jury. I mean, there was one of the women on the jury I seen as she was walking out, she was trying to hold back the tears. And I don't doubt that they also seen a reflection of themselves in this trial and what happened to Ashling Murphy.
And you see, like, you're right, like, there is no two tiers of victims, and people, if they live complicated lives or whatever, no more deserve to die of murder than anybody else, you know. But I mean, it's still shocking that this sort of thing can happen. And, you know, because, like, I've been in trials where, cases where somebody was maybe drunk or out of their heads or something, and they commit a horrific act. And you can sort of, I'm not saying it excuses it, makes it okay, but you can at least understand that in a moment of rage or whatever, somebody acts and does something like this. There is no sense of that coming out of this trial, because we don't know what Jozef Puska did. And the reason we don't know is because he decided to get on the stand, which is really rare, and lie through his teeth.
Yeah.
And put that family, I mean, like, we're sitting in a newsroom anxiously waiting a verdict. How must it have been for the family to await that, to have to go through, I mean, very graphic evidence of how she died. The families would have obviously known information about her death, but wouldn't have had to sit through that kind of really detailed description. And, you know, that's sort of another step of immorality, I think, from Jozef Puska.
Absolutely. I mean, hearing those details of the post-mortem was absolutely gut-wrenching. When it was kind of revealed to the court that the reason Ashling Murphy couldn't scream or make noise was because her voice box had been so damaged, that the blood vessels around her neck had been so badly damaged she would have had nothing but blood in her throat. That was really heart-wrenching to hear, and I really hope that that's information the family had been privy to prior to hearing that for the first time in court, because I can't imagine how that would feel to hear in such a public forum as well. I mean, they're conscious as well of the fact that they're in this room hearing all this information and through the trial, but they're also in a public setting. There's members of the media there, and there's members of the public there, and it's inhumane what they went through. I mean, I do also, I can see what you mean about, you know, if there's some reason, some rhyme or reason why these things happen, but in this case there's not. I mean, we don't know what his intentions were that day. We don't know why he did what he did, because, like you said, he got up on the stand and lied through his teeth. Which
is rare, you see, because like, if you've been in a courtroom or in any circumstance, to actually stand up in public and say black is white, it's quite a difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, to be able to do that under pressure, being cross-examined for a full day in a court, there has to be something off with the person.
Yeah.
To stand up and lie so publicly and with a degree of confidence. I know he was speaking through an interpreter.
Yeah, I mean, I would say as well, there was a kind of a level of feeling like the barrier between him and the microphone and telling the court was that translator.
Yeah.
He wasn't exactly saying to the court in English.
Yeah.
You know, he was getting it. He had the kind of the privilege of translating through somebody else, and they were the ones delivering that to the court. So I would imagine that was some sort of barrier for him, some sort of wall to protect himself in what he was saying, but no less. It's sociopathic to.
It is. I mean, it's
do that to a family.
Because I mean, if people commit moments of madness and do stuff, but they tend to feel remorse and you know that didn't seem to be there in this case.
No.
I mean, also like subsequent to the trial, which stuff we weren't published, we often know about a history of a defendant where, you know, they may have done some horrific crime before. There is no sense of that from Jozef Puska.
No, nothing in his past would indicate that this was coming down the line.
He lived in Ireland, was it 5 years or?
He's been living in Ireland since about 2012.
2012, sorry.
And there's been absolutely nothing. I mean, like I said, there was a huge sense of family values around him in terms of his whole family being there today and throughout the trial. But also, I suppose, one of the things he said, now he says he only remembers this, is that when he was in hospital he was asking after his family and he was worried for them. And so obviously there is those familial ties, but the fact that he could be so worried about his family and thinking of them and what might happen to them, but not having the same regard for Ashling Murphy's family is quite something. I mean, I do feel really sorry for his children. He's got 5 children who are going to grow up without a father. Their father's going to be in prison now for a long time, and his youngest child at the time of the murder was only 10 months old, so they're heading into 2-3 now, and you know, their father's been in custody since they were 10 months old, so they're not going to know them. Obviously that doesn't bear in comparison to the family of Ashling Murphy, who are never going to see her again, and don't get the benefit of being able to visit her in prison.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're going to hear now maybe more, some stuff may come out, but there, like, as far as can be told, there is no smoking gun, if you want, of you know, because there are some people that offend from their early teens and continue to offend throughout their life. That doesn't seem to have been the case in this case. I mean, I think it's interesting to look at the judge describe some of his excuses as nonsense, because I mean, it wasn't you know, they weren't it wasn't a well thought out plan, was it? I mean, there were some bits of it that were almost farcical, like, you know, even if you look at the bit where he said he ended up in a ditch for 4 hours. And
yeah, it was quite bizarre. I mean, the judge did actually refer to this man in black that supposedly attacked Ashling Murphy and Jozef Puska as a COVID compliant killer, because he was making fun of the fact that this guy was out murdering and stabbing people, yet he was, you know, COVID compliant. He had a mask on, so that's why Jozef Puska didn't see his face. I thought that was quite comical, because if this man exists, where's been the effort to find him? There is none, because he didn't exist and doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And he's not going to come before the courts anytime soon, because...
And then there's
Jozef
just this
Puska.
web of lies about how he was, you know, he told the police he was stabbed in Blanchardstown. Then later on the stand, he was saying he'd received the injuries at a different time. And it's just these constant lies.
Yeah, like, I mean, we still don't know where or when exactly he got those wounds, whether it was in an attempt after the stabbing. I mean, by the time he got to hospital, the blood on the wounds were dry. I don't know if he inflicted them on himself in Crumlin or if he inflicted them on himself before he even got home from Tullamore Town. He says that he was in that ditch for 4 hours, but the prosecution put it to him that he wasn't unconscious. He was hiding because the area became a swarm of activity. There was guards, there was ambulances, there was, you know, onlookers trying to come up and see what was going on. There was so many people in the area at that time. He would have had no escape.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at as well how he put, like, you know, a bit of amateur psychology, like, if, you know, not only does he put himself as somebody who didn't commit this murder, he actually puts himself as somebody who tried to save Ashling Murphy. Like,
yes.
It's quite a sort of narcissistic
Very.
thing to do, because remember, he could have, which most people who are facing a murder charge say nothing. It's just a no comment. They never speak in court. So he could have done that, but instead he actually tried to present himself as a hero of the day.
Yeah, I mean, he could have. I mean, I think he obviously said something at the time when he was in hospital, and then, you know, by the time he was arrested, he needed to make something else up. So, but to actually go at the very first day of the trial, when the defence began their cross-examination of the very first witness, Jenna Stack, and they had put it to her that he was, she wasn't the very first, she was one of the first witnesses. The defence put it to her that perhaps he had been in the ditch trying to save her. And when that was said, there was kind of an audible kind of shift in the mood in the room of gasps. Like, the journalists were shocked. I suppose we didn't know what his defence was going to be, if there was going to be a defence. But for him to try and suggest that from the very onset, it was shocking, to say the least.
It is. It's a weird way to present yourself, having killed a woman, to actually try and present yourself as a saviour, and then to follow through with it by going on the stand and saying it. I mean, it's not everybody who does it. And I think it's also a kind of a trait of that sort of narcissistic thing that if I say this, people are going to believe me. Now, Jozef Puska, he hasn't been formally sentenced, but because he's been convicted of murder, he's automatically going to serve a life sentence. There is no other tariff you can get. So I suppose, you know, I'm sure many people know, but a life sentence in Ireland there's no minimum number of years and there's no maximum. So he could be, in theory, in jail for the rest of his life. There's no onus on the state to ever release him. However, the average amount of time people spend in prison for a life sentence, I think, is something between 17. It used to be 17, but it might have gone up a bit at this point. So he can apply for parole after a certain number of years. I think it's 14. But he will automatically receive a life sentence. You know, we didn't hear anything about, you know, his psychology, but we will have another further hearing, I think. Did it give a date of that? Yeah,
so the sentencing hearing will be on the 17th of November, which is next Friday. And I do believe they'll possibly as well put forward if there's any mitigating factors from both the defence and the prosecution. I mean, there's cases where I've been at sentencing before, and at that point they do start bringing the stuff that the jury haven't heard. But yeah, that is next Friday. And I mean, he's only 33.
Yeah.
If he comes out, he's going to be in his 50s.
Yeah.
If he comes out in 20 years' time. And I mean, am I right in thinking that you can't actually leave the country? Isn't that part of the parole?
I'm not fully sure. I mean, you're basically on licence.
Yeah.
Even when you're released, you're on licence, and you can be brought back into jail without a trial, effectively. So if somebody's on a life sentence and, for example, they're in a fight in town, they can be automatically returned to prison. I don't think they're allowed to leave the country, but there may be circumstances where you can apply, and particularly in the EU, maybe you would be allowed to move around. But that is it. You remain on licence and you can be returned at any time. I suppose the broader question is, we're going to see a load of people obviously reacting to this verdict because of the scale of the trial, you know, huge amount of interest, you know, and we've already had a certain amount of, you know, anti-immigrant stuff is already out there. There's going to be other people viewing it from different lenses, you know. I mean, as a young woman, do you feel that it is a case that's affected young women in particular? Do you think that it's...
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I remember at the time there was a general sense of fear among young women.
Yeah.
I used to walk to the gym after work and I'd be on the phone to my video call to my mum the whole time on my way there. And there was definitely a palpable sense of men also at the time, I feel like, would take the moment to step back in the context of what was going on and move away and let you know that they weren't following you.
Yeah.
I definitely affected young women in that sense in the immediate aftermath. I think as well it highlighted a huge issue of violence against women in Ireland.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many women that are murdered behind their you know, and there's violence going on behind closed doors and everything like that, and they don't nearly receive as much attention as something like this has happened.
Yeah.
And because, you know, Ashling Murphy was seen as such an upstanding member of the community, a young woman, and I think as well a lot of young people, like I said, I seen myself in that, would see themselves in her position.
Yeah.
And understanding that sort of fear. And I think one of the things that struck me about this case was during the trial was Jenna Stack and Aoife Marin, when they ran away, they said that they were in fear that somebody was being raped and was in harm's way. Yeah. And the two men that they approached said, one of them said that, oh, sure, it's none of my business. It's just what happens around these parts. Whatever happens between a couple, but happens between a couple. And the other said she thought that the women were overreacting. I think that really highlighted the difference in the reaction of men and women, because women, the worst thing that can happen to them is they're going to be raped and murdered by a man. I think for a man, the worst thing that can happen is a woman will laugh at them.
Yeah.
And I feel like there was that really highlighted for me the sense and the difference of the fear levels among men and women.
And of course, like, there wasn't a sexual assault in this case, but that is obviously the fear that goes on. Yeah, I mean, I think it's because we don't have a reason, and I think that's kind of even referenced in the court. Like, it's going to leave it open to interpretation. But I think, and that's the nature of society, you know. But I hope for Ashling Murphy's family that there is some relief in a verdict. They were there every day, more or less, the whole family, and you know, your thoughts have to go with them. I mean, they're by all accounts a lovely family who would never have imagined this landing at their door, and then to have gone through that grueling process. And there's no doubt that they will have even found the media attention and hearing all of that stuff really, really difficult. So, you know, your thoughts are with them.
Absolutely. I mean, this kind of story, I mean, it's caused it's been on the international stage.
Yeah.
And I do think it's going to be one of those cases, unfortunately, you get sucked up into that true crime, you know, frenzy of activity. But I really do hope that they can have some peace now.
Yeah, and of course it becomes a political football as well
for
various people, and, you know, I don't think that necessarily is right, but look, our thoughts are with them, I think it's fair to say, tonight, and we will come back to the case when we come to the sentencing again. And thank you very much, Clodagh.
Thank you very much, Niall.